They said nobody wanted grandpa's buildings anymore. That's what I heard echoing through the glass-walled conference room that October afternoon. We need fresh blood on the innovation team, Kenneth Barker said with a smug smirk, adjusting his cufflinks like he was delivering a stock market forecast. Not outdated concepts from the 90s. Around the table, a few of the younger partners chuckled, too spineless to meet my eyes. My name is Marcus Ellison. I'm 58 years old, and I've been an architect for more than 3 decades, longer than most of the people in that room had been alive. I've designed hospitals, schools, housing complexes, not just pretty shells, buildings that worked with the land, that respected energy, that stood for something. But that day, none of it seemed to matter. We were in the headquarters of Cedar and Sage Design, one of the biggest architecture firms in Denver, Colorado. The afternoon light poured through the windows, casting long golden rays across the sleek glass table where my career was being quietly euthanized. I sat with my hands folded, listening to the same firm I'd helped grow call me irrelevant. Kenneth, now one of the managing partners, looked at me like I was a classic car that didn't fit into their sleek Tesla showroom. Your design philosophy has become, let's say, too heritage-driven. The market wants sleek, tech-integrated builds. You're still creating buildings that feel like they're telling stories. Our clients want buildings that post well on Instagram. I scanned the room. Not one of the architects I'd mentored for years would meet my gaze. Not James. Not Aaliyah. Not even Jenna, who used to shadow me like a little sister. They were all part of the new wave now. Digital first, aesthetics over function, image before impact. We're restructuring, Kenneth continued, sliding a manila folder toward me. Effective next week, you'll transition off the innovation team and into our historical restoration division. It was poetic in the most bitter way. After 30 years of building forward-thinking, eco-integrated designs, I was being shoved into a box labeled Fix Old Things. My life's work, my ideas, my passion, being filed under obsolete. And the kicker? They were handing off my active projects to Harrison Ford. No, not the actor. A 29-year-old fast-tracker with great hair and a portfolio full of glass cubes and chrome. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I just asked, when does this take effect? Monday, Kenneth said, already glancing at his phone like the conversation was over. As I stood to leave, my eyes landed on the presentation board behind him. Pinned there were my concept drawings for a sustainable housing development designed to harvest solar energy, recycle gray water, and provide rooftop food gardens. The design was modern, scalable, efficient, and dismissed as heritage-driven. They had no idea. As I walked the familiar hallway back to my office, the whole building suddenly felt foreign. I joined Cedar and Sage back when we were a 6-person studio above a bike shop. Now, we had 6 floors of high-rise office space and a culture that valued appearances over architecture. When our founder, Martin Sage, retired 5 years ago and sold his shares, the heart of the firm left with him. Kenneth had climbed the ladder fast after that, slicing away anything that didn't fit his vision of modern elegance. He never understood sustainability. To him, it was a checkbox, not a compass. Back in my office, I paused to look at the framed photos on my shelf. The community library I designed in Fort Collins, built almost entirely with reclaimed timber. The Denver Public School, where we cut energy consumption by 65% through thermal mass strategies. The family housing in Aurora that gave 40 veterans clean, affordable homes. These weren't just buildings, they were my legacy. And yet, they called me a relic. Then came the ping. An email notification on my personal laptop. It was from the Colorado Urban Housing Coalition, marked high priority. I'd entered one of their design competitions months ago on my own time, under my own name. No Cedar and Sage involvement. The project was a concept for modular, green housing design for low-income families across the state. A labor of love I'd worked on after hours in my basement studio. The email was short. They wanted to meet. Tuesday. Suddenly, I didn't feel so obsolete anymore. I spent the weekend pretending I was okay. On the surface, everything looked normal. I went through the motions, made coffee, cleaned the house, took a long walk around Washington Park. But beneath it all, something restless stirred in me. I wasn't mourning the job. I was mourning what I thought it meant. 30 years. And in the end, they saw a man clinging to the past. But what they didn't see was the fire they just relit. Saturday morning, I pulled out the plans I'd submitted to the Colorado Urban Housing Coalition, spread them across the dining table, and stared at every line, every note I'd scribbled in the margins during late-night drafting sessions. These weren't designs drawn to impress a boardroom. They were born from real frustration, from watching families struggle to afford decent housing in a city choking on rent hikes and zoning red tape. My vision was clear: modular homes that could evolve with the people who lived in them. Start small, grow with the family, shrink again when the nest emptied. Everything about it, from passive solar orientation to rooftop food gardens and gray water recycling, had one goal: serve people and protect the land beneath their feet. I tweaked a few things, tightened the roof pitch, simplified the irrigation schematic. And the more I worked, the more something strange happened. I felt free. No oversight. No Kenneth peering over his tablet, asking if I could make it more Instagrammable. No pressure to impress clients with buzzwords. Just me, my mind, and 30 years of grit and knowledge flowing through every stroke of the pencil. Sunday, my daughter called. Claire. She lives in Portland with her wife and their 2 kids. We talk every Sunday without fail. "You sound different, Dad," she said, halfway through our call. "Not upset." "Oh, I'm upset," I told her, spinning slowly in my office chair. "But not broken. Maybe even a little excited." Claire laughed. "You? Excited? About being booted to the B team?" "Not about that." I paused. "About what comes next." I told her about the coalition's invitation, about the presentation, about the design I'd done in secret, not for the firm, but for me, for the city, for the people who need homes more than they need sleek steel facades. "You should have left that place years ago," she said, not unkindly. "You were loyal to a ghost." She wasn't wrong. For years, I'd clung to cedar and sage because I believed in its bones. I helped build it. But somewhere along the line, while I was teaching interns how to use passive airflow systems and arguing with developers about recycled brick, the soul of the firm got traded for glossy marketing decks and lifestyle branding. And yet here I was, possibly on the verge of doing the best work of my life without them. That night, I stayed up late, rereading the competition guidelines, reviewing my notes, practicing my pitch. I thought about how long it had been since I'd felt this alive. This wasn't a presentation anymore. It was a resurrection. Tuesday morning, I left my house before sunrise. There was something sacred about the stillness of that hour. No noise, no traffic, just me and the quiet hum of Denver coming awake. I didn't wear a suit. I wore what I always wore when I needed to feel grounded. A button-down shirt I'd owned for years, worn at the elbows, with faint pencil marks on the cuff from too many sketches made in a rush of inspiration. The Colorado Urban Housing Coalition had set up the meeting in a modest conference room downtown. Nothing flashy, just 5 folding chairs, a projector, and a whiteboard. The kind of space that made it clear this wasn't about ego or appearance. It was about ideas. When I walked in, Dr. Angela Morales, the director of the coalition, greeted me with a firm handshake and a sharp gaze that said she didn't care where I'd worked. She wanted to know what I could build. "Mr. Ellison, thank you for coming in. We were very impressed by your submission," she said. The panel was made up of a housing policy advocate, a structural engineer, a community development officer, and a city planner. All eyes on me. I took a deep breath and started. I didn't talk about aesthetics. I didn't lead with buzzwords. I talked about people. I showed them how a family of 4 could grow a third of their own produce on the roof, how water runoff would be captured and filtered, how the sun would heat the floors in winter and airflow would cool the walls in summer without a single kilowatt wasted. I showed them the cost breakdown, the real numbers, not just how much it would take to build, but how much families would save every year in utilities and maintenance. And then I said something I hadn't rehearsed. This design wasn't created to win an award. It was created because I'm tired of watching good people priced out of living in a city they've called home their whole lives. It's not just about building homes. It's about building dignity. Silence followed, but it wasn't the uncomfortable kind. It was the kind that happens when a room is listening, really listening. The structural engineer leaned in, How does the modular system handle seismic load variance across different soil types? I smiled. A real one. Finally, real questions. We talked for over 30 minutes. They dug into technical specs, cost trajectories, neighborhood integration plans. Every answer I gave didn't come from theory. It came from experience. From buildings I'd designed, mistakes I'd learned from, and victories I'd earned when no one was watching. As the session wrapped up, Dr. Morales nodded slowly. We have several more presentations to hear, but I'll say this, Mr. Ellison. Your proposal doesn't just meet our criteria. It speaks to what this city desperately needs. I thanked them, gathered my materials, and walked out into the Denver sunshine. Something had shifted, not just in the room. I walked back into cedar and sage that afternoon like a ghost returning to its old house. The building looked the same, polished concrete floors, minimalist lighting, a reception desk that probably cost more than my first car. But something was off. Or maybe it was just me. Maybe now that I'd glimpsed what freedom tasted like, I couldn't unsee how stale the air here really was. The younger architects, the ones who once nodded politely as I passed, were suddenly more curious than cordial. Whispers trailed behind me. Conversations died when I turned a corner. I didn't need a newsletter to know the news had spread. Word travels fast in our industry, faster when it's uncomfortable. I got back to my desk in the historical restoration wing, what Kenneth liked to call the archives, a quiet part of the building tucked away from the glass conference rooms and bold mood boards that filled the innovation floor. Here, I was surrounded by drawings from the 1920s, brittle blueprints, and file folders that smelled like dust and legacy. I didn't mind the quiet. What I minded was pretending like it hadn't all changed. Mid-morning, Harrison stopped by. Tall kid, nervous eyes, trying too hard to act like everything was normal. "Hey, Marcus," he said, lingering at my door. Just wanted to say congrats." I looked up. "For what?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "The project. The housing design. The coalition thing. It's all over the local boards. People are talking." I nodded once. "Thanks." "You know," he added, stepping into the room a little more, "I've been reviewing your files on the Aurora Community Hub. The airflow system you designed is honestly genius. I wouldn't have thought to orient the ventilation channels that way." I gave a faint smile. "Because you weren't building during the 2003 drought." He laughed, caught off guard. "Right." I motioned to the chair across from me. "You hitting a wall?" He's Saturday the Scottsdale build. The client wants to add mechanical cooling to the retail spaces, but it throws off the energy model. I'm not sure what to do. I opened the drawer and pulled out a binder. My notes from that project, dated and dog-eared. This design was built on passive thermal balance. The Adobe keeps the heat during the day and releases it at night. If you bring in compressors, you're not just adding energy load. You're creating conflict with the wall structure itself. It won't breathe. He blinked. Breathe? Yeah, buildings breathe. At least, the good ones do. We spent the next hour reviewing the original intent behind the design. Not just the math, but the purpose. Why the windows faced east. Why the plaza was recessed. Harrison took notes feverishly. He wasn't dumb, just untrained in the language of restraint. When he stood to leave, he paused. "Marcus, I don't get it. Why did they move you off the innovation team?" I met his eyes. Because sometimes experience makes people uncomfortable, especially when they confuse new with better. He didn't know what to say, so he nodded and left. And I sat there in the silence again. Not bitter, not broken, just patient, because I had a feeling this was only the beginning. Friday morning arrived with that eerie calm I've come to recognize in life. The kind of stillness that precedes something irreversible, like the air right before a storm breaks or the last second before a verdict is read. I was already at my desk in the restoration wing, surrounded by sketches of early-century Denver bungalows and city zoning reports from the Roosevelt era, when my inbox pinged with a subject line that stopped me cold. FCH Next Steps, 2 p.m. call. FCH, the Front Range Coalition for Housing, the formal body overseeing the Colorado Urban Housing Initiative. My heart skipped, then pounded like it was trying to remind me I was still capable of feeling hope. I didn't move right away. I read the email 3 times, then a fourth. It was short, almost sterile, but the words "next steps" lit a fire in my chest I hadn't felt since I walked into my very first client pitch 30 years ago, back when my hair wasn't gray and the world still felt wide open. I replied with one word: confirmed. The next 4 hours were a blur. I tried to keep working, reviewing a structural survey on a 1914 Tudor duplex, but the numbers wouldn't hold still on the page. I kept glancing at the clock, then at the framed photo on my desk of the Solace Center in Aurora, the first building I ever designed without compromise. No budget slashing, no corner cutting, just purpose turned into structure. It reminded me of why I'd held on this long. At 2 p.m. sharp, my phone rang. Mr. Ellison, came Dr. Angela Morales' voice, confident, clear, no hesitation. Thank you for joining us. There were others on the call. I recognized the names from the committee meeting, but I barely registered who said what because I was holding my breath for the words that came next. I'm pleased to inform you, she said, and in that moment, the world seemed to pause, that your modular sustainable housing design has been unanimously selected as the winning proposal for the Colorado Urban Housing Initiative. Silence. Not from them, from me. For a second, maybe two, I was completely unable to speak. My mind reeled, not from disbelief, but from the overwhelming realization that the world hadn't passed me by after all. That while Kenneth and his had pushed me aside for being too grounded, too thoughtful, too principled, this committee had just rewarded me for exactly those things. Thank you. I managed finally, my voice low, steady, stunned. I'm honored. Truly. Dr. Morales continued. We'll be making the formal announcement Monday morning during a press conference at City Hall. We'd like you to be present, of course, to speak to the design and answer any public questions. It's going to be a major initiative, our largest affordable housing investment to date. The first 200 units will break ground within 18 months. She said other things about media, about schedules, about future phases and interviews, but all I could think about was the journey that had brought me here. Not the months I'd spent drafting this design in my basement, but the decades I'd spent accumulating the wisdom to know what mattered in a building, in a community, in a life. Every lesson I'd learned by being told no. Every time someone told me, that's too idealistic. Every budget cut, every zoning meeting, every delayed permit, every 2 a.m. redesign, suddenly it all added up to this. When the call ended, I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, feeling a kind of quiet triumph that didn't need to be shouted. I didn't text Claire. I didn't call old colleagues. I didn't post anything. Not yet. There was something sacred about keeping the victory to myself for just a little while longer, like a sunrise you don't want to share until it's fully risen. Because I knew that come Monday morning, the world would know. And Kenneth? He'd be watching. Monday morning in Denver was unusually warm for October. A soft, golden haze hung over the skyline, as if the city itself had paused to take a breath. I'd barely slept the night before, not out of anxiety, but anticipation. The kind of tension that builds in the chest when you know something's about to happen that you'll remember for the rest of your life. I arrived at City Hall 30 minutes early. Old habit. I've always believed in showing up before the room fills, before the noise starts, before the moment arrives. I wore the same gray blazer I'd worn to my very first interview out of grad school. Tailored, scuffed at the edges, reliable. My daughter Claire had offered to fly down from Portland, but I told her to wait until the first shovel hit the ground. Today was mine to walk alone. Dr. Morales met me at the door, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp and focused. Mr. Ellison, she said, shaking my hand firmly. You ready? I nodded. 30 years of ready. The press conference was set up in the grand lobby. Arched ceilings, tall windows letting in columns of light, rows of folding chairs already half filled with reporters, community leaders, a few architects I recognized from my years in the circuit. In the front row sat Mayor Evelyn Tran, a woman known for her no-nonsense leadership and her commitment to practical change. Her administration had made housing a top priority, not just in words, but in concrete. At exactly 10 a.m., she stepped to the podium. Good morning, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. Today marks a turning point in our city's future. A future that demands we think boldly, sustainably, and humanely about how we house the people who live and work in Denver. She spoke about the rising costs of living, the climate pressures, the need for housing that doesn't just shelter, but uplifts. Then she turned toward me. We received dozens of proposals from across the state, each with its own strengths. But one stood above the rest, not because it followed trends, but because it understood what truly makes a home. Today, we are proud to announce that the winning design for the Colorado Urban Housing Initiative was created by Denver's own Marcus Ellison. Applause, flashbulbs, and then I stepped forward, not as someone looking for redemption, but as someone who had nothing left to prove. This design, I began, my voice steadier than I expected, is the product of 30 years spent listening. Listening to families who wanted more than just four walls. Listening to neighborhoods where homes became burdens instead of blessings. Listening to the land itself, how it moves, breathes, stores warmth, and sheds water. I talked about the adaptability of modular units, about how families could start small and expand as needed, about rooftops that grow food, walls that breathe, systems that save money and reduce waste. But I also talked about dignity, about how housing, at its best, isn't just about shelter, it's about belonging. The materials are humble, I said, but the vision is ambitious, because we believe that the people who build our cities, teach in our schools, clean our streets, and care for our elders deserve homes designed with as much thought and respect as any penthouse downtown. More applause, more cameras, and just behind the second row of reporters, I saw them, two architects from Cedar and Sage, Jenna and Thomas. They weren't clapping, they were watching, and I could tell from their faces that the realization had finally landed. This wasn't just a project, it was a statement, one that had just changed the conversation across the city. Afterward, reporters swarmed with questions. A journalist from the Denver Post asked about construction timelines. A young blogger wanted to know how the design would hold up during wildfire season. Someone from Architectural Digest asked if I planned to patent the modular system. I answered them all, not with rehearsed lines, but with the quiet authority of someone who had built things that lasted. By the time I stepped out into the Denver sunlight, my phone was buzzing with messages, colleagues, city officials, even a former client from Utah who'd seen the live stream. One text, though, stood out among the rest. "Claire, saw the broadcast. You look like someone who finally got the mic he always deserved. So proud of you, Dad." I stood on the steps of City Hall, sunlight on my face, and realized that this wasn't a comeback story. It was just the first chapter of a brand new beginning. I walked back into Cedar and Sage that afternoon like I was stepping into a memory that no longer belonged to me. The same receptionist sat at the desk, the same scent of polished concrete and espresso in the air, the same murmur of voices behind glass-walled meeting rooms. But the weight in the room had shifted, slightly, imperceptibly to most, but not to me. It was in the way Janet, the front desk clerk, gave me a quick nod and a smile that lingered half a second longer than usual. In the way two junior architects paused mid-conversation by the elevator when they saw me pass. Their expressions weren't mocking or smug this time. They were searching, trying to reconcile the image of the man relegated to heritage restoration with the one who just stood at City Hall announcing the largest modular housing initiative the city had ever seen. I made my way to the far wing where the forgotten projects lived, past the marketing team's sleek displays, past the glass trophies on shelves, past the innovation board that hadn't changed in weeks. The door to my tiny corner office creaked the way it always had, and I stepped inside, setting my bag down, letting the silence settle. I didn't sit. Not yet. I just stood there, watching the lights slant across the files on my desk. Restoration plans for a 1933 firehouse, sketches of original brickwork detailing, the kind of projects they gave you when they wanted you present but quiet. The phone rang. I let it ring once, then twice, then picked it up like I already knew who it was. "Marcus," came the voice, smooth, measured, and wrapped in the same false composure I'd come to know well. "Kenneth Barker. Congratulations," he said. "The press conference was impressive." "Thank you," I replied, calm as a lake in winter. "I was hoping we could speak privately," he continued. "There are some developments the partners and I would like to discuss." "Of course," I said. "Shall I come to your office?" A pause. Yes, that would be fine. 6 weeks after the press conference, I stood on the dusty edge of a construction site on the south side of Denver, boots sinking slightly into the earth, wind tugging at the collar of my coat, and watched as the first trench was carved into the ground. It was a cold morning, colder than usual, but I barely felt it. The crews were already at work, moving with the practiced rhythm of people who build things for a living. Excavators groaned. Surveyors checked levels. Cement trucks rumbled nearby. But for me, it was the silence underneath all that noise that meant something, the silence of vision becoming real. The project site wasn't glamorous. It was an old stretch of city-owned land that had once been home to a set of crumbling storage units and overgrown lots, abandoned for years, forgotten by time and progress. But now, this plot would become the pilot phase of the Front Range Green Housing Project. 200 modular units, a courtyard, share gardens, passive solar orientation, rainwater harvesting, rooftop produce beds. All of it, every line, every slope, every angle, was born in the late hours of my home studio, back when I thought no one would ever see it. Now it was happening. I met with the project manager on site, a no-nonsense woman named Rosa Gutierrez who had built affordable housing developments across 4 states. She was efficient, sharp-tongued, and had a sense of humor drier than the Colorado air. "Ellison," she said, flipping through a binder thicker than a phone book. "Your specs are solid, but I'll tell you right now, if these rooftops don't drain right after the first snow, you'll hear about it before sunrise." I smiled. That's why I angled them at 17 degrees. Snowmelt goes straight to the catchment tanks. Gravity does the rest. She raised an eyebrow, nodded once. "Good. I like when architects think with physics, not Photoshop." That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the site alone. I stopped near the northwest corner, where the first foundation frame had just been poured. I knelt and pressed my palm to the concrete, still damp, still forming. And I thought of all the moments that had brought me here. The night I first sketched the modular layout on a diner napkin, the argument I'd had with Kenneth about cost versus conscience, the phone call from Claire telling me not to give up, the cold silence in my office the day they moved me to restoration. I hadn't forgotten any of it. I didn't want to. Those moments were the mortar between every brick I would now lay. The community council had invited me to speak that evening at a town hall just a few blocks from the project site. Residents, local business owners, city officials, they wanted to meet the architect, the man whose name was suddenly in the news for designing the future of affordable housing. But when I took the mic, I didn't talk about the future. I talked about roots. I told them how I'd watched this city change, how I'd seen it grow, stall, price people out, forget its teachers, its postal workers, its retirees, its caretakers. I told them this project wasn't a blueprint. It was a message. A home, I said, should never be a luxury. It should be a promise that you matter, that you belong here. When the meeting ended, people lined up to shake my hand. A young mother with 2 children thanked me for thinking about utility bills before floor-to-ceiling windows. An older man who'd lived in the neighborhood since the 70s told me the courtyard reminded him of the block parties they used to have when kids rode bikes until dusk. And one city planner, quiet, maybe early 30s, just looked at me and said, "You gave us something we can believe in again." That night, I walked back to my rental car under a sky littered with stars. The air was sharp. The city was quiet. And in that quiet, I whispered something I hadn't said aloud in a long, long time. I'm just getting started. 6 months later, the houses were no longer lines on paper. They stood proud under the Colorado sky. Clean lines, sun-warmed facades, rooftop gardens already sprouting with early greens, and children's laughter echoing through courtyards that once existed only in my mind. The first families had moved in just days earlier, and already the neighborhood felt lived in. Not polished, not staged, but alive. I stood on the edge of the main walking path, coffee in hand, watching as a mother carried groceries into her kitchen from the community co-op next door. Her son ran ahead of her, darting between planter beds, barefoot and beaming. A mural had gone up on one of the utility walls, painted by local artists, vibrant and unapologetic. It wasn't part of my original design. It was better. It was theirs. That was the moment I knew I'd done it right. Not because of awards or headlines, but because people were making it their own. The ribbon-cutting ceremony had taken place the previous weekend. The mayor spoke. Reporters came. Kids handed out lemonade in biodegradable cups. My name was mentioned, sure, but only once. And that was more than enough. This project was never supposed to be about me. It was about reclaiming the idea that good design didn't belong to the elite. That beauty could be affordable. That a building could carry warmth, not just in temperature, but in intention. And then, the inevitable happened. Kenneth showed up. I spotted him standing near the community board, pretending to study the laminated flyers for local childcare and farmers market hours. He wore a charcoal overcoat, his hair slicked back the way it always had been, eyes scanning the layout like he was taking mental notes for a pitch he'd give somewhere else under a different name. We hadn't spoken since the day I walked out of his office. He saw me. Of course he did. He gave a small nod, hesitant, unsure whether to approach. I waited, and when he did, it was with the strained politeness of a man who had miscalculated the future. "It's impressive," he said, gesturing toward the homes. "You really built it." "No," I said quietly. "They did. I just gave a framework." He shifted uncomfortably, as if expecting me to gloat. But I didn't. I had no desire to rub anything in. The work was enough. The laughter behind those walls was enough. "We're looking into similar developments," he said. "Public-private models. Modular concepts. There's appetite now." I nodded. "Then do it right, Kenneth. Don't chase headlines. Build homes." A pause. Then he asked the question I knew was coming. "Any interest in coming back? Maybe leading a joint initiative?" I looked at him for a long time. Not with anger, not with pride, just with the quiet certainty of a man who had learned that validation never comes from being welcomed back to a room you outgrew. "No," I said. "I already arrived." He didn't argue, just nodded again, tighter this time, and walked off, fading into the background a neighborhood that no longer needed his approval. I stayed a while longer, letting the sun warm my shoulders, watching the families settle into rhythms, dinner tables being set, windows opening for fresh air, laughter trickling through screen doors like music. Claire called that evening. I told her about Kenneth. She laughed. "Some people build to be seen," she said. "You built so people could live." I didn't need a response, because that was it, the whole lesson. In a world obsessed with disruption and reinvention, I had proven that wisdom isn't outdated, that sustainability isn't a trend, that experience doesn't expire, it matures, deepens, sharpens, and sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't making noise. It's building something so quietly right that the world can't help but listen. If this story resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who's ever been told they're too old, too slow, or too stuck in the past. Because sometimes all it takes is one spark of belief to ignite a whole new beginning. Subscribe for more powerful stories about quiet strength, second chances, and building something that truly lasts. Like if you believe experience is not a weakness, but a foundation. Comment below. What's one moment in your life where you chose to walk your own path instead of following the crowd? Together, let's celebrate the builders, the dreamers, and the ones who never stopped believing, even when no one else did.